Hey friends, good to see you again. It's Pastor Shari here. Okay, I have a question. Who else in the room is just a little bit tired of being cooped up on lockdown, under quarantine, and all of the things that we've decided to name this crazy time that we're going through? I am. I'll admit it. I'm a little bit tired of being cooped up. I'm over it. By nature, I'm an introvert, but right now, I just really want to hug somebody. I do. I need to see people. I especially need to see my family and my friends and my church people. I'm a little bit over it and I'm a little bit discouraged. But I didn't come here today to share my discouragement with you. I came here today to share my excitement and to encourage you in something that I read in scripture yesterday. I read Psalm 66. And in Psalm 66, verses 8 through 12 particularly caught my attention. And I'd like to read those to you right now, if you don't mind. Psalm 66, 8 through 12 says, "Praise our God, all peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard. He has preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. For you, God, tested us. You refined us as like silver. You brought us into prison and laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance." Now in these 5 verses of Psalm 66, the author is praising God for the deliverance of God's people. And in the verses just prior to these, the psalmist was specifically talking about the deliverance of God's people from the oppression in Egypt. But here he's speaking in a more general sense. The psalmist is remembering the collective struggles of his people, his fellow Jews. And more importantly, he's remembering the faithfulness of their God. And we, like the psalmist, should remember the suffering of our own, God's chosen people, not for the sake of sadness or bitterness, but for the sake of rejoicing over what God has done for us. The psalmist was remembering a time of oppression. And while we're not specifically facing oppression or rampant persecution, Satan would have us to believe that this isolation we're enduring is meant to threaten or destroy God's church. But we have thousands of years of biblical history to draw from to see that God does work in and through difficult times. And if his people are willing to humble themselves in faithful obedience, they come out better by the grace of God on the other side of suffering. But how? How are we made better in suffering? Because during difficult times in the Bible, God is testing and refining his people. We see it throughout Scripture. Take a look at Psalm 66, verse 10. It says that God tested us and refined us like silver. This example of refining comes from the process of refining precious metal. The metal is heated to extreme temperatures to draw out any impurities so they can be removed from the metal. When God takes his people through times of testing and refining, he too is revealing and drawing out the impurities in his people, both individually and collectively, so that we will be more faithful and godly people. The psalmist here goes on to describe other dire circumstances the Israelites faced in verses 11 and 12. In verses 11 and 12, it says, "You brought us into prison. You laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance." Look at the end of verse 12. It says that God brought them to a place of abundance. God wasn't a silent observer in the midst of their oppression. He was working things for their good. And Jesus had something to say about difficulties of this world as well. Look with me in John chapter 16, where Jesus is telling his disciples about a time of grief that would be turned into joy for them. Verse 33 says, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Look at the contrast Jesus makes between himself and the world. When he says, "In the world you will have trouble," Jesus is saying that the world offers peace that it cannot give. And what he says of himself is profound. He says that in him we have peace. And this is a peace that only he can give, and he gives it right in the midst of our trials. And this peace is a peace that the world cannot take away. So look at one other thing with me. Look at the last sentence in verse 33. When Jesus says, I have overcome the world, the verb has is in perfect tense. It's not in past tense, meaning that he did it once before, and it's not in future tense, meaning that it's something that was going to be done in the future. It is in perfect tense, and that means that the task has been completed and does not need to be repeated. He has overcome the world. So be encouraged. This time of separation from family, church family, and friends shouldn't be seen as a time of discouragement or defeat. God is still sovereign, and he's still working on behalf of his obedient children. So let's agree to be excited for the peace that only he gives in the midst of this situation, and for the place of abundance that is waiting for us on the other side of this situation and on the other side of this life. We have much to be thankful for.